Welcome, Anne. I appreciate you being here today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to share some of my work with all of your folks in your audience.
And if you don't know, Anne is the author of Spiritual Practices for the Brain, Caring for Mind, Body, and Soul, and A Year of Spiritual Companionship. So, Anne, can you tell us a little bit about those books?
Sure, my latest book, published by Loyola Press, Spiritual Practices for the Brain, takes 11 different practices, and we'll talk about some of those today. That they're spiritual practices, but through my neuroscience research and positive psychology research, those are my other academic backgrounds besides theology. It shows how these practices help not only our spiritual lives, but also help our cognitive abilities, help maintain our cognitive functions, and also our emotional well being, our psychological well being. So it's nice that all three of these areas recommend similar practices. And I was fortunate enough in the past year to win several first place awards for faith and science and faith and well being, my book, Spiritual Practices for the Brain. So it's an exciting time to be able to share these practices with everyone.
I love it. And they're so interrelated. When I do my research on
Mhm.
generosity or financial wellness, and you realize as you kind of go into all the research, there is scientific data. There's
Mhm.
hormones. There's
Mhm.
a lot of stuff that
Right.
happens that can support you on your journey, but also you need to be aware of that might work against you. And I think
Right.
it's something we need to be aware of as Catholics. It's not just spiritual or physical; that these things go together. Can you tell
Yes.
us what led you to starting investigate this connection between the two?
Well, I have a background. I have a degree in environmental engineering, and starting in 2008, when our son was beginning to study neuroscience, he said, "Mom, this stuff is really, it really links with what you do." So, I also have a graduate certificate in positive psychology, and I saw that how each of these areas that were so fascinating to me. I've always been a science-oriented, math and science-oriented kid, but also I have a deep contemplative bent in my life. I love walking in the trees and climbing trees when I was a little girl and being outside in nature and seeing God's presence in all of creation. And so these areas of my own interests just dovetailed beautifully into these practices that I either had already had inklings to practice or perhaps just were interesting to me. So I found that in doing this research, and I should mention that my research in the science area, I only use research from blue ribbon, journals that is peer reviewed. It is not like what your Aunt Susie told your cousin Martha. You know, it is absolutely solid blue ribbon research because there are a lot of scientific ideas out there right now that really are not verified. And so it's really important for me to let people know that I'm being very careful in the science that I share with you. But it's so fascinating. And it's just my own life's interests all along have really brought me to this point where I get to show everyone how good these practices are for our health and well being
And what did you find by bringing all this blue ribbon research together?
together. Well, starting with something as simple as the breath. The word breath in our Christian tradition is also translated as spirit, spirare in Latin and pneuma in Greek. Those are the same words. Breath and spirit are the same thing. So even just starting with a simple breath practice, just taking deep breaths several times a day, lengthening our exhalations. We know that when we lengthen our exhalations, that brings more calm to our bodies. The parasympathetic system is initiated, and so we release stress during the day. So making that a prayer practice, like breathing in God's love, resting as we exhale in God's peace, doing that several times a day, just a simple breath practice. And then that can bring a mindful presence of God to our lives every time we take a breath. And I often remind people, link it to a practice you do, link it to a little action you do every day. Like every time you turn on the light, it could be a cue. That's my cue to take a deep breath in God's presence, or going up and down the steps, or opening and closing doors. There's so many things we do every single day repetitively that can be the little links to taking a deep breath, reminding ourselves we're in God's presence. I write about Brother Lawrence from France, who talked about, remember, God's just like a little glance. Give a little glance to God throughout the day. And I love that language of the little glance. It's like when my mom sent me to school, my brother and me, angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, that prayer. And so I think of that like a little angel looking over my shoulder, God being with me throughout everything. And then moving on to how good meditation is for our brains. And actually, long-term meditators can do as well as 20-year-olds on visual and spatial tests. They're gray matter. The prefrontal cortex is the area right behind our forehead. And that's the area that we need to really keep healthy. And we also want to stay with less stress, because if we don't keep stress at bay, that prefrontal cortex and the connections back to the other parts of our brains, they go offline. And so we don't make good decisions. We make quick decisions. We may not even have any space between our thought and our response, so we react, and we may do something that we regret later. So it's important that we keep that prefrontal cortex healthy so that those connections remain and we can make good decisions.
I love that you are linking these practices to our Catholic faith, because I find that sometimes when we talk about these practices, some people may feel it's new age or it's something.
Yes. Yeah.
So can you talk to that? Because I find it's fascinating, and I have some other questions afterwards, just to link this back to the financial component. But can you speak to that element first?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Well, that was really the main motivation for me writing the book, Spiritual Practices for the Brain, because, and I say in my introduction that, a lot of times people hear these words like mindfulness or meditation or taking breaths or being grateful, that, like you said, new age or something. But, we have these traditions in our Catholic Church. We have the saints of St. John of the Cross. We have St. Francis de Sales. We have the Catholic Catechism even says that meditation is important for each person in our lives. I mean, we have these traditions, but no one has really uncovered them to link them to this science that we have too, that says, yes, do this for your body and brain health as well. We have lots, Julian of Norwich and Saint Teresa of Avila, all of these saints in our background in our Catholic Church have talked about spending time in quiet, just being with the friend who loves us, and we know God loves us, and just be quiet and sit with that, not even saying any like mental prayers, but just saying, I'm just going to sit here being with God simply in silence. And silence is part of our tradition too, and it's not just from a modern new age sort of teaching, but it really is deep, many hundreds of years back into our tradition, from the 1400s even.
Oh goodness, I love it. And when I bring all this research in, it's really fascinating that financial stress can cause these other things that we don't realize how they affect our lives in so many ways. But it can cause a 10% decrease in IQ. It increases marital stress.
Oh, yeah.
Increases, cortisol levels, all these different physiological things.
Right.
What I find fascinating as well is that it has a multi-generational effect, that when children are raised in a stressful environment, that prefrontal cortex can't develop. So they are not able to physically put time between impulse and action because they didn't have those connections developed. So does your research lead to the same conclusions in other areas of stress as well?
Yes. Part of my research is also on telomeres, which are the end caps of our chromosomes. Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn is that 2012. Yeah, she's the 2012 Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology. And her research was on telomerase, which is the enzyme. Remember, in biology class, you learned anything ending with an ASE is an enzyme. And that's what keeps our telomeres healthy, that we need to have good production of telomerase. Those end caps of our chromosomes can fray more quickly if we are under stress. And that premature fraying causes premature aging. And you can see those effects in children and in young adults, and adults, of course, too, who are under stress. They have, like you said, the prefrontal cortex does not develop as well. Even in children as young as 8 years old, they see that their telomere length is already prematurely shortened because of the traumas and because of the unstable neighborhoods that they may be living in. So their ability to learn, their health in general is already compromised because of those shortening of the telomeres. So we want to keep those telomeres healthy. And the best way to do that is keep stress at bay. Stress will shorten telomeres. So every time your cells divide, those telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. And the problem is when there's no longer any telomeres, and the cell dies, the cell just doesn't sit there. It actually sends out pro-inflammatory messages to the rest of our body. And we know inflammation is the cause of a whole host of diseases, and mental as well as physical diseases. So, if we want to keep Alzheimer's at bay, if we want to keep cognitive decline at bay, we want to keep those telomeres healthy. We see this when we see a president enter his administration, and 4 years later, 8 years later, what do you see in the hair? It's grayer,
Right.
because telomere length also shows up in hair follicles, and hair follicles die. That's what happens when the pigment cells die, and so we don't have color in our hair. We have gray hair instead, and that's due to stress as well. So premature graying can be related, not always, because it could be a genetic factor, but can be related to stress. So stress has an incredible amount of problems head to toe, and like you said, cortisol is released, and cortisol is also damaging. We have our the whole axis that winds up we want to have cortisol come into our bodies. If we see something like a child running out to the street, we want to be able to jump and grab the child back. So we want to have cortisol in our bodies. We want to have that fight and flight response when it's appropriate, but it's not appropriate most of the time. Our brains were developed, our ancestors' brains developed to always be aware of danger. So we have what we call the negativity bias. We're always looking for what's wrong out there. We're scanning for problems. And we grab onto all the things that are problems. We hold onto them like they're Velcro, but it's not helpful in our modern world. We don't need to be holding on to every nasty comment in a comment section, or every, an email that wasn't really satisfactory. We need to let those things go. So one of the researchers in neuroscience says we should take in the good as it's Velcro and let the bad slide off like Teflon. But our brains are just the opposite, the way they've developed. So we're really trying to work with these evolutionary tendencies in our brain to we've got to let go of the difficulties. They're usually not life-threatening like they were, though, for our ancestors. Our ancestors had life-threatening animals and berries that were poisonous, et cetera, everywhere in their environment, but we don't have that. So we need to, learn to take a deep breath, settle ourselves back, being grateful for what we have, being grateful. But Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Catholic monk, is really the primary teacher of gratitude in the world. And he says we should be grateful in situations, not necessarily for situations, meaning that, yes, things can be really difficult. I had COVID very early on, and I was in bed for a long time, had a fever for 11 days. But even in situations like that, I can say, what can I be grateful for? I'm grateful I have a roof over my head. I'm grateful I have a husband to take care of me. There's things we can be grateful for, even if we can't be grateful for that situation. In that situation, we can be grateful for them.
So I'm hearing some different things, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So we're talking about, we're going to have stress. I mean, there's going to be stressors that hit us.
Right.
You had mentioned COVID. There's other people that have financial stressors from job loss. I live in Las Vegas. It shut down the entire industry here for a year,
wow.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have these stressors. So it's a matter of, if I'm hearing you correctly, resilience with those stressors, because
Yes.
it's not that we can always, there is environmental controls. We can learn how to avoid certain stressors, but when they happen, we need to learn resilience. And it sounds like you're saying resilience should be centered in gratitude.
Yes, that's one of the key practices for resilience. The other piece, though, is just being mindful that we are in a stressful situation, and also practicing self-compassion. These are all chapters in my book, self-compassion. I just gave a workshop yesterday on this. Self-compassion helps us to serve others as well. We need to take care of ourselves so that we can also take care of others. And the more we practice self-compassion, the more we're able to deal with these financial stressors or these environmental stressors. We are not going to live in a world that is stress-free. And we need to learn to deal with stress too. A little bit of stress is not bad. We need to have stress in our life so we can learn to deal with it appropriately. But when we allow those thoughts to continue winding through our head over and over and over again, our thoughts also have all sorts of negative responses in our telomeres and in our bodies and our brains. So our thoughts also have as much of to do with our health as our actions do, because they have, and Harvard did a really great study about this a few years ago and really showed how much just thinking about piano playing changed the motor cortex in people's brains as much as those people who actually put their fingers on the piano keys. People just thinking about it. So if you think about, like, you have to have a stressful conversation, even thinking about it can make your heart rate go up and your sweaty palms and feeling anxiety and feeling like you got to walk around the block to walk it off. We have stress that just from thoughts. So it's important that we manage what we're thinking about. And that's where the practice of mindfulness and taking a breath and gratitude and self-compassion, all of those come in. One of the other practices that I really recommend, and people were doing more and more during COVID, is getting out into nature. We know that just 15 minutes of getting out in what we call awe walks, just taking a walk and being awed by the creation around us, or even if just sitting amidst trees or listening to birds, that also decreases our stress hormones. It allows our brain to feel to be healthier. And again, is a very, very effective way of controlling stress. One of the scientists that I follow regularly, I listen to an hour or two lecture of his every week, is Dr. Andrew Huberman from Stanford. And he talks about when we're dealing with stress, don't try to think our way out of it. We have to use our bodies in some way. So we need to get up, we need to stretch, we need to dance to music, we need to walk around the block, something physical, or just simply taking deep breaths and again, exhaling longer than inhalations. Those are all little tools that we can use to release the stress that we may be feeling. We are going to feel stress, but if we want to keep those connections and make good financial decisions and other decisions, we've got to keep those connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of our brain. We've got to keep those open and healthy. If we're not keeping stress at bay, we're not going to make good decisions. It's as simple as that. And we know that making a decision when we're under stress is like trying to think about things with loud music blaring in the background. It's not, those pathways are shut off from us. They are not available to us if we are under stress. Those connections between our prefrontal cortex and the rest, that prefrontal cortex is absolutely imperative to keep online so that we can make those good decisions and keep our emotional regulation proper. We can't do that if we're under stress.
So interesting. Yeah, because when you're right, when we are under stress, there is stuff happening physiologically. So you're climbing an uphill battle here.
Yes.
And you also spoke about self-compassion. And I was listening to, I can't remember her name, it was a professor from UT Austin yesterday, but she was talking about self-compassion versus self-deprecation. And we tend to do this, especially in a financial way, because our financial decisions can have long-term impacts on ourselves and our families. So what can someone do to get out of their own mind? If when we're in our own mind, it's not God talking to us, right? So you can't think your way out of stress. If someone is in a financially stressful situation, what can and should they do to break and interrupt that cycle and get out of their own minds here?
Well, there's several different things you can do. And what I always recommend is, one of the oldest theologians in the Catholic Church said, each one of us finds their own unique path to God. And this was like back in the 200s and 300s and 400s, like long time ago at the very beginning. Each of us in our own professions has a unique path. So, I give lots of different pathways to release our stress and to move forward, but each of us will be different. So I'm going to give you a couple different options. One of them is, and what I find effective as someone, because I have a greeting card company, Cards by Anne, and I'm always creating To be creative, I can't be under stress. I cannot do anything well, not, if I'm under stress. I can't think of a creative idea. And often finances are the same thing. We need to be creative in our finances, in our financial situation. We cannot do that if we are stressed out. So, like I said, you can put a breath prayer practice into your day. Now you may feel like, oh gosh, I'm just wasting my time. It's one more thing I have to do. But you can do this even just sitting at a traffic light. You've got 2 or 3 minutes instead of trying to pick up your phone, which we shouldn't be doing anyway. To use it as a little gift. This is a little contemplative gift that you've been given to take a deep breath in God's presence and not think about anything. Release all of the worrisome thoughts. The more we can just acknowledge our worries, but then release them, we can get into places where we can make better decisions. And then, as I said, that leads to a mindful attitude where we name the thought that we're having. I'm feeling really out of sorts right now. I'm feeling like my body is really stressed. Just naming that is an important first step. And once we name it, we say, okay, this is difficult. This is difficult. You might even cross your arms over your heart. We know just a physical touch, or hug your child or your partner. Just having the physical touch releases, excuse me, oxytocin, which is like a little opiate that makes us feel better. It's the love hormone. So even just giving, if things are really tough, even when I was struggling with recovering from COVID, I did this regularly, just giving, if my husband wasn't around and I could, but he didn't want to get too close to me. We didn't know he gave it to me, but until we did. So, just giving yourself the love and affection that you would a good friend. And when we're under stress, we often think that we need to do all sorts of things that we wouldn't even ask a good friend to do. Like when I was sick, I was really worried that I wasn't answering emails quickly. And I thought to myself, would I tell a good friend who was sick to get up out of bed and go answer emails? Of course I wouldn't. So treat ourselves. Remember, God loves us too. And that we need to care for ourselves as we could imagine God caring for us, that God cares for us. Don't be putting too much on top of our plates, which sometimes is what causes too much stress, is we think we have to do everything today. Remind ourselves we have tomorrow. We can take a deep breath today. Be grateful for what we have today. Be grateful we have these, almost be grateful for the financial problems that we have finances in order to even consider. There's people in the world who are refugees who don't even have a roof over their head, or don't even know where they're going to eat tomorrow or even this afternoon. So just being grateful that we even have these resources to ponder and to think about, how am I going to get through this next hurdle? So that piece of gratitude, of self-compassion, again, getting out into nature, even serving, even amidst financial situations that are difficult, getting out into community, being a part of a community is really important. Harvard did a research on people who attend church, and they found that people who are churchgoers tend to be more psychologically healthy because they have other people who know them, rely on them. We can ask people to pray for us. We feel connected to other folks. And then when they are in situations, we support them as well. And that makes us feel good. And that's healthy for our brains and our bodies. It's so cool that all of these practices in the Catholic community are actually good for our brains and our bodies.
It's amazing when you look at the whole big picture and you realize how the Holy Spirit has given us all these gifts, but we do get in our own minds, and our hamster does not want to get off that wheel. So I'm thinking of a big meeting I had yesterday. It was a lot of work to prep for. As soon as the meeting was done, the only thing I could think to do was go for a run. That was the only thing my mind wanted. Great. And those interrupters are just so powerful. After I had that run, it was a half hour of the day, got back and could jump back in with a fresh state of mind. So those little interrupters, gratitude, being out in wilderness, or being out, just getting fresh air, community. And we can't minimize those, especially when it comes to our finances. And finances in particular can be isolating. We have our ego wrapped up in it. We have, and our ego is, it's tied to just our sense of self, and self-ego, or self, what's the word I'm looking for? Self-esteem is tied to self. So finding our esteem through God and through Jesus and through all those different things, is really the greatest interrupter of all, because we see
Right,
that we're part
right.
of this whole thing.
Right, exactly, yeah,
Love
and
that.
that and feeling, when we don't have self-compassion for ourselves, we isolate ourselves, and
Mhm.
isolation, as you said, it's the worst thing. People want to be helpful, ask
Yeah.
for help. One of the worst things, and I'm a recovering perfectionist, so I know all about trying to do things on my own, trying to not make mistakes, etc., and I'm still working on that, even at my age. But what I discovered more and more as I've grown older is people want to help us. People, ask people for help. They're honored that we've asked them for help. Maybe ask someone who you see is financially on great stead, and maybe ask them for what advice would you give to me? You've obviously made great decisions. People feel honored to be able to help. When I was sick with COVID, I had neighbors sending over
Mm.
soup and different treats, and I couldn't eat most of them because I wasn't feeling that good, but just a sense of being cared for by others. They loved it. It made us even closer now than we ever were, because they reached out to me when I was in need. So allowing others to help us is another important piece. Asking for help, and it does mean, like you said, you have to let that ego kind of recede a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to let my ego go and I'm going to ask for help. But just know that people love to help. And wouldn't we love to be asked when we're in a situation when we
Mm.
can offer advice and offer help? It's a great gift. And, research shows that being able to give to others, makes us so happy, and actually winds up for people who are volunteers have a much lower rate of death than people who don't ever volunteer. So I mean, even death and disease is impacted by our ability and our willingness to give and take.
All related. It's all related there.
Yeah, yeah.
And you had said there was 11 practices. I know that we covered several of
Mhm.
them. Are there
Yeah.
any other that we didn't cover that you think can be helpful to someone going through financial stress?
Well, I mentioned creativity. That's one of the
Mhm.
practices, because sometimes financial situations require us to think creatively. So that's one of them. And I mentioned mindfulness and meditation and gratitude, being self-compassionate, being in community and serving. Those are two different ways. Another thing it's one of the chapters in my book, and it's really important, is digital distraction. We wind up whenever we're distracted, and we're distracted regularly if we have devices around. That's really bad for our brains. It's really bad for our stress levels. So and in my book, I have lots of suggestions on how to do that, like keeping a phone out of a room, not having any. I never, after I've done this research, I don't have any um, noises on my phone where I get pings for texts or anything. I just check my texts a couple times a day. All of this helps our brain and deal with stress, but also keeps our brain healthy. So really drilling down on healthy habits surrounding our technology, that's a really important piece. And it winds up really showing how much better our brains can be, even if you do just a little bit, try to draw back less. And for children, it's enormously important, because their brains are still developing, to try to make sure that we don't just have them babysit with technology. To really, they also need to get out into nature, read a book, be creative, draw something. Those are all important pieces too. Not necessarily relating to financial health, but again, if we don't have the brain cells available
Mhm.
to deal with any financial situations, that technology really does impede those abilities of ours. So those are kind of the main chapters of my book. And every chapter has practices in order to help us. There's little gray boxes scattered throughout each chapter saying, this is a practice you might want to try. I always recommend to don't try to try everything at once. Just take one practice and try to do it for a week. More important to do it frequently than to have a long duration. Neuroscience also tells us frequency is more important than duration. Doing things every
Mhm.
single day, a couple times a day, much more important for rewiring our brain and getting our good pathways all set up so that we can make good financial decisions.
That is fascinating, because I was actually doing research for a project we're working on. And especially with finances, we often focus on the finish line. We're very finish line
Mm.
oriented.
Mhm,
Really, we should be
mhm,
starting line oriented. So just
mhm.
showing up and doing these
Yes,
just starting the practice
right,
is where the
right,
habit happens. And that's where the change
right,
happens, is the constant showing
right,
up rather than focusing on the
right.
finish line.
Right, right. Because the finish line can feel overwhelming, really.
Mhm.
I mean, you think, "Oh my gosh, when am I ever gonna get there? It's gonna be 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is." It's the start, and you and habits are tough to break, and habits are tough to start. So linking again, linking that habit to a key physical thing, like, say you wanna go for a walk every morning, put your shoes out and put your clothes out right next to your bed, so when you wake up, they're right there and you can get into them. There's no friction involved in that new
Mhm.
habit. We want to make it as frictionless as possible, setting up so like put it so that you're not always, annoyed by your phone, putting it in another room, so making it more filled with friction that you have to go check your phone. So just thinking about those sorts of habits and putting more friction in between the ones you want to get rid of and putting less friction in the ones that you want to embody and start nurturing.
I had this Marine that I was working with years ago when I was working with sailors and Marines, and it was the funniest thing that he did, but it works, and now I use it. And what he did was he couldn't stop his credit card spending. So he went and got a Ziploc bag and put water in the Ziploc bag and put the credit card in there and then froze it. So if he wanted to use the credit card, he had to
Had
defrost
to
the whole thing. And so
the whole
there was,
thing.
yeah, so it was like an
Yes.
artificial, you were
All
saying
that.
the
Mhm.
prefrontal and the decision
Yes.
and the
Mhm.
action. He created that artificially because he knew he didn't
Yes.
have that himself,
Yes.
which
Mhm.
was
Yeah. You
fascinating.
put like I said, you put friction in between the actions that you may not wanna do. So, say you just love to go out to Marshall's and buy new clothes.
It's
Um,
dangerous.
but it may Oh, very dangerous. That's why I mentioned it because, just walking into Marshall's, oh, wow, for $2 and things you don't need. But putting friction in there, maybe making sure you never pay with a credit card, you always pay with cash. Who's got
Mhm.
$20 in their wallet and cash? Oh, most of us don't walk around with that much cash anymore. But setting up some guidelines for yourself, and like your sailor, putting a credit card in a frozen bag. I mean, that's genius because then it takes some time. The more space we can create between actions and decisions, that's excellent because it gives our brain a chance to say, is this something I want or something that I'm just responding to? Is it an impulse? And we want to create that space. And again, that's where mindfulness comes in, being mindful and then creating those when we don't have the impulse, when it's, when we're just thinking about those, trying to create, and that's where creativity comes in,
Mm.
creating other steps along the way that either will make it easy for us to save. I know they show that people who have automatic saving taken out of their paychecks, their savings are way easier because they're not even thinking about it. Again, that's a frictionless savings plan. Just goes right into savings, don't even have to think, and in 10 years you've got all the savings and you haven't even thought about it. So just trying to make it an easy path to savings and a difficult path to spending, those things that we don't necessarily need. So putting the friction where you need it and taking friction out where you don't.
I love it. This has been a fascinating conversation, Anne. I feel like we could keep going for a couple hours.
Oh,
I
we
feel like
could.
all of our research is overlapping so well. But is
Oh,
there
that's
anything else
great.
you'd like
Yeah.
to share? We're going to put your book in the show notes so we can
Oh,
make sure people have
great.
access to
Okay.
that. Is
Yeah.
there anything else?
Yeah.
You mentioned Cards by Anne, which
Yeah.
for the audience, we had met at the Las Vegas Diocesan Conference where you had a table and these gorgeous cards. They're beautiful. So
Yeah.
you
Oh,
have a
thanks.
website.
Yeah. Right. It's just cardsbyann.com. And if you have any questions for me, I always answer. If you're looking for other types of books that you'd like me to recommend, just go to cardsbyann.com. Ann's with an E. And there's a place where you can just email me. And I've been doing these cards for almost 40 years now. It really for the Catholic market. And I do the calligraphy and artwork, and then they get reproduced. So, and we keep them really reasonable, $1.50, $1.75, really reasonable for folks so that they can, share the good news with all sorts of people. So yeah, feel free to go to the website. And my book's on the website. You can go to Amazon or Loyola Press or your local bookstore.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Caitlin.
All
Okay.
right. God bless. All right. So I'm
You
going to hit
too.
end
Blessings.
broadcast.